for automated vehicles. My name is Dr. Jill Haug, and I'll be moderating today's event. I direct the Small Urban and Rural Center on Mobility, located within the Upper Great Plains Transportation Institute at North Dakota State University. We conduct research, we also offer training and outreach, and we educate the future workforce, all related to transportation. What you'll see is that this webinar will be recorded and it's going to be posted on the Pennsylvania AV Summit website if you would like to view it in the future or recommend it to others. Before we begin, you'll see that the microphone has been automatically muted. We've done this to reduce any background noise. Please feel free to use the chat function throughout the webinar and also utilize the Q&A section at any time to ask questions about the presentations. Our chat moderator will voice all the questions during the Q&A portion of today's webinar. I'd like to thank you all for taking time to listen to our fantastic lineup of speakers. Before we get started with our speakers, we would like to thank SAE for sponsoring all of the Summit Series webinar events. Just a little background about the Summit Series. It's a series of virtual events created in the wake of the cancellation of last year's 2020 Pennsylvania AV Summit Conference. This event is the 6th in the series of webinars leading up to this year's 2021 Summit. If you have missed any of the previous Summit Series events, recordings are available on the Summit website at pennsylvaniaavsummit.org. This event is the last in the Summit Series. The next event will be hosting the 2021 Virtual Summit, which will take place in October. More information on this year's summit will be provided at the end of this webinar. Now on to our first presenter for today. Our first presenter is Amy Kessler. She is North Central Pennsylvania MPO's Director of Community Development and Regional Planning. To see Amy's bio, as well as any of the other speakers' bios, you can see those on the Summit website. So with that, we'll go on to Amy.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks, Jill, for the introduction. I'm hoping everyone can see my screen okay and can hear me okay. But a little bit about North Central Pennsylvania. We are certainly a rural region. We cover about 5,000 square miles. It's about the state of Connecticut, and about 42 people per square miles. We have one huge public transportation agency that covers that geography, and that's the Area Transportation Authority, and a couple commercial service airports. When it comes to autonomous vehicles, I think there's two areas that are opportunities for autonomous vehicles to make their way into the rural communities. If you see on the screen before you, we have an average commute time of 22.6 minutes, and that is exacerbated by the consolidation of our hospitals into regional centers and people having to travel larger distance to get to medical appointments as well as for employment opportunities. So the two areas I want to focus on a little bit where I think coming out of the gate where there's opportunities in the rural parts of in Pennsylvania and rural parts of the country are related to access to healthcare and the challenges and opportunities around it, as well as public transportation and the opportunities and challenges of increasing ridership by utilizing autonomous vehicles. When it comes to healthcare, as I mentioned, in Pennsylvania and rural Pennsylvania, we are seeing the consolidation of hospitals and the regionalization of hospitals. And what that really means is, again, people, having the ability for an individual to access healthcare is a key to their everyday life. And they don't always have access to that care due to lack of transportation options. And I think this is an opportunity as we struggle to find volunteer drivers, as we struggle when it comes to access to transportation issues, that this is an opportunity for the autonomous vehicle to take a foothold in rural Pennsylvania. The biggest issue we see in healthcare providers is a lot of trips to the emergency room via ambulance and not being able to find a ride back, no night shifts, weekend hours for public transportation, people trying to find dependable transportation for their dialysis appointments, or just getting for quality of life for the grocery stores or for their medicines. is become a challenge in that first and last mile connectivity. When it comes to public transportation, there's a feeling of isolation in rural areas due to cuts in public transportation services. There's a lot of longer wait times, distance between stops, accessibility to those stops with an aging population, and maintaining those public transportation routes that are critical are challenging when it's a struggle to find qualified insured drivers to transport people to those life-saving facilities. Rural Pennsylvania in general is really struggling when it comes. In our region, there's no taxi services, very, very limited ride hailing and on-demand transportation services. And so it's one of those issues that it's right for an entrepreneur, but it's also limiting those options for people who either don't have a vehicle, can't afford a vehicle, or for whatever reason has lost the opportunity to secure a vehicle and to drive that vehicle. So some of the challenges I mentioned, we in Pennsylvania are a breeding ground for the technology evolution of autonomous vehicles with Carnegie Mellon University, Penn State University, and others that are really focusing on how the autonomous vehicle will interact. We don't see a lot of that in the rural areas. I think there's opportunities within our hospitals and, as I said, our public transit. Loss of access to an automobile is economically and socially devastating for rural areas. They cannot get to employment. Again, they can't get to their hospital appointments. An aging population. I'm old enough to remember that I was told never to get into a car with strangers. Now there's an app for that, and now we're going to be telling people they can get in cars with no drivers. And so it's going to be an education process to get people to understand, what the technology is and how it can improve their quality of life in the long run. We have farmers that are driving their equipments on rural roads, making wide turns, imposing lanes. So how do those conflicts with autonomous vehicles, what studies are being done, and how is that looked at in rural areas? Weather constantly changing in north central Pennsylvania, as is a lot of areas across the country. 1 minute it's not snowing, then you have a whiteout. And so what's the opportunities to look and study that for an autonomous vehicle, and how do they react to inclement weather conditions? And then just the rural topography and deploying the technology, and how does that looked at? So here's where I have a couple of the rural opportunities that I think we need to find a way to make public transit more attractive and convenient to younger drivers, and autonomous vehicles and new technologies that are supporting that innovation, I think, is going to be key. Some of which have never going to ever own a vehicle may only be looking at autonomous vehicles. There's certainly an opportunity within our major hospitals and our employment centers if we can just get autonomous vehicles to run within their campus network to get people between the parking facilities and the actual main hospital or main employment center. I think you can see some baby steps into the world of autonomous vehicles. Limited planning done in rural Pennsylvania and especially north central Pennsylvania. So how do we look at active street fronts as we're doing this? How do we work with communities to make sure that they're building in transit stops and autonomous vehicle stops? How are they integrating that into their communities so there's less conflicts, or the conflicts are more appeasing to the traveling public? And are AVs a short-term solution for the first and last mile of paratransit and on-demand services? I think one thing we've all recognized in the last year with COVID-19, there's an appetite for people to want to remote work in rural Pennsylvania, and there's an appetite for people in urban centers to relocate to rural communities if we can get through the broadband issues. But there's going to be expectations of local deliveries, and is there a role for AVs in that first last mile for rural communities? So with that, again, I'll leave you with the two areas that I think that there's baby steps into AV in Pennsylvania is going to be around new ridership opportunities for our public transportation, and to kind of close the gaps in the evening and night weekends hours, as well as within our hospital and major employment communities to get people to and from distant parking areas to their employment site or for their appointments. So with that, I thank you. And I will turn it back to Jill.
Excellent. you so much, Amy. Thank you for sharing that local perspective and the challenges that we're facing. And with that, we're going to move on to our next presenter. Our next presenter is David Kapp. He is the Western Transportation Institute's Executive Director located at Montana State University. David, we turn it over to you.
All right, thank you, Jill. I was going to say we rural people think alike, so a lot of what Amy said, I'm going to say ditto. But you know, talking about those challenges and opportunities, and certainly there's a little bit of both in rural areas. This is a picture. Yellowstone National Park is actually doing a pilot demonstration this year in a relatively small section of the park, looking at using autonomous vehicles to get people around. So a lot of federal lands are in rural areas, and so that's another opportunity for people to look at. We know in rural America, you've got to think about a lot of different things. So as Amy was saying, you know, what are those conditions? Do you have those big weather changes? Can you have avalanches? The wildlife considerations, the communications challenges, and a lot of things to think about in rural America. And as we know, especially in the automated vehicle realm, there's a lot of different disciplines. So not only the engineers, but it's more computer people. And as she said, the psychology of people getting on the vehicle, thinking about the weather conditions. You know, do you have to worry about the wildlife? And are you close to rivers? And what does that mean when you get floods or some different things? So a lot of people need to be involved in these discussions. And I'll start again by saying, you know, when we think about autonomous vehicles, to think about mobility in general, and it's a means to an end. It's how we live our lives. I think we all know we're kind of done with the Zoom meetings and some of these things, and we all want to get back to those in-person meetings and those things, that human connection. So, you know, very important that we do about that. And I always remind people that mobility is expensive. And so, you know, typically for most folks, housing and transportation can make up half of your budget and a family or individual's budget. And those can interplay with one another. We know in communities where it gets very expensive for housing, people will move farther away to get that down to what is kind of that standard of a third of your take-home pay. But that can play into your transportation costs, commuting costs going up. And so it is expensive to be out and have that mobility that we want. And the American Automobile Association does a great job of, you know, saying what that cost is. And as Amy was saying, when you live in rural areas, those opportunities for healthcare, jobs, those things, can be farther away, so you're commuting longer distances. And one of the things that comes up with talking about autonomous vehicles is will it be more of a shared ownership model, to where I don't own my own autonomous vehicle, but I have access to one. So when I need to go somewhere, I push a button and that vehicle shows up within 5 or 10 minutes, and then I'm charged based on my use of it. Maybe I have an annual fee to have access, but I don't own my own one that might bring me to work and then go home and park in my garage there, that I'm only kind of paying for it when I use it. So some things to think about when we think about that as well. So again, what is rural areas? And the feds make it pretty easy and say, well, it's all the parts of a state that are not in urban areas. While we're waiting for the census to be finalized, Bozeman, we're going to hit the magical 50,000 mark and move into that small urban category probably, but we were the 4th largest city in the state. So again, some people would say, oh, Bozeman's a big city if you're from Montana, but maybe not so much from other areas. Another term we like to use a lot is the frontier. And through the 1890 census, the Census Bureau said the frontier was an area with 2 or fewer people per square mile. 23 of the 56 counties in Montana meet that definition. Health and Human Services has defined that. maybe down to 6 people per square mile. They look at, is there a medical facility that can handle a heart attack or a cesarean section birth and some things. So that term is still kind of out there, and it's just another way to have maybe help define this when we talk about rural areas. And just to define for Montana a little bit, Montana is about 16,000 square miles larger than these 10 eastern states, yet we have a population that is 2% of the combined population of those states. And to put in a little more finer perspective for those from Pennsylvania, looking at population, we're a little over 1 million compared to close to 13 million for Pennsylvania. Look at the land area, the square, number of counties, the average people per square mile, the biggest community. Amy talked about the commute time. The average commute time in Montana is just under 20 minutes. High number of people who are commuting alone, and certainly a much smaller percent of people who commute using public transportation. So I know people are listening from a lot of different states, but again, some of those challenges are the distances, the number of people. Some of that makes AVs a little better option, some maybe not so much. As Amy kind of touched on, frontier and rural areas tend to have an older population. You see a lot of the young folks moving out from what was kind of that ag-based, maybe mining-based community. You have people who are driving farther for just about every aspect of life, getting to a job, getting to those healthcare opportunities, just getting to a good grocery store. You're typically driving a longer distance. People in rural areas tend to hang on to their vehicles longer. So again, if that point where you can go out and buy those fully autonomous vehicles, that adoption rate is going to be higher in urban and in small urban areas, because people in rural areas just tend to hang on to their cars longer. We talked about the unimproved roads, whether it's a gravel road or just not good stripage and those things. And then the other thing is there's not a lot of alternate roads. So, when you're going 45 miles between some of those communities, if something happens to your primary route, you can quickly go, wow, to reroute is going to take me twice as long to get there. And so that comes into a question of, are a lot of these autonomous vehicles electric vehicles? Because if they are, those distances really can become a challenge in some ways. But there are those opportunities to use autonomous vehicles, provide mobility for those aging in place. As Amy said, it's harder to find drivers with a CDL if you're paying them, or even those volunteer drivers. I know in a lot of rural areas, it's the 65-year-olds are taking care of the 85-year-olds. So I think you've got that saying who are going to be able to provide that mobility. The mom taxi, where you have the young kids who aren't quite old enough to have their driver's license, and they want to go to a friend's house or where those activities are. Talking about after school activities, does the school district provide a way home, or once the main school day is over and the school buses leave, if you're practicing basketball, football, whatever, after school is getting home up to you. Amy touched on this, and I always laugh and say in rural areas, it's the first and last 35 miles to get to those other modes or opportunities. It's not like in urban areas where it's just really a mile or two. In rural areas, it's 25 miles or 45 miles to get to that. And then we know a lot of the raw materials, whether it's, coal, wood, a lot of the food that's grown in the country is grown in rural areas. Being able to get that to market, what can we do, and can autonomous vehicles help us with that? So again, considerations, we talked about the distances of travel, thinking about the sizes of vehicles on these rural roads, the road conditions, the weather. One of the things we have a lot in rural areas is where you have state highways coming into towns and all of a sudden becoming a main street. And so that dynamic of what that autonomous vehicle is dealing with changes quickly from kind of a, hey, I'm on a pretty straight road and I don't have much interaction with pedestrians or things, that now I'm in a, in a main street and I have a lot of pedestrians and the streets are different and the access points are different and a lot of those things. Amy talked about the wildlife considerations. Certainly a big one is going to be that confidence in technology. I think you're going to, again, probably see it proven out in big urban areas first, and then people say again, okay, does it work in rural areas? And of course, there's a host of other ones. And so as the technology matures and those things happen, I think hopefully you'll see that gaining in confidence and people more willing to test it in rural areas and see how it works. And there's a host of others that, they're still being dealt with as far as liability. I think, again, the ownership models will be interesting to see, and some other things as we keep progressing and seeing how things work. So, what's on the horizon? I think we're all interested to see. A lot of us know that they said that the hype about autonomous vehicles probably peaked in about 2018, but actually getting them to the market is still a ways out there. So we'll see what happens, but certainly looking forward to it, as it's an exciting time, and all of those that are working in research are looking to see what our role can be to bringing this technology and these opportunities to the market. So that's what I have, and looking forward to the other presentations and the questions and answers at the end.
Great, thanks, David. As we can see, there's a lot of very similar challenges looking at the rural areas, but there's also a lot of differences. So we know that one size does not fit all when we start looking at applying AVs in rural areas. So thank you very much, David. Moving on to our next presenter. Our next presenter is Dr. Ranjit Gatharthi, who is North Dakota State University's Assistant Professor of Transportation and Logistics, and he also serves as an Associate Research Fellow at the Small Urban and Rural Center on Mobility. So turning it over to you, Ranjit.
Yep, just a minute. All right. Hello, everyone. Today, thanks, Jill, for the introduction. Today, my topic would be geared towards the use case of autonomous vehicles in transit agencies, specifically looking at rural and small urban areas. So, as we all know, various kinds of automated vehicle technologies are rapidly being tested and deployed on public roads, and most of these are in passenger vehicles. And if you think about it, there are great advantages and scope for applying these technologies even in public transit industry, and a lot of transit operations in the United States. And agencies in multiple cities have been experimenting with various kinds of vehicle automation technologies, be it driver assisted systems, ADAS, advanced driver assistance systems, ADAS, and fully autonomous shuttles, which got more media coverage in the recent times. And when we think about rural and small urban transit agencies, they are less exposed to these changes in technological developments. Therefore, a good outreach, guidance, and technical assistance is needed for agencies in this realm. So this study that we have conducted looks at the AVs from their perspective, what are their needs and challenges. So The main purpose of the study is to learn about the transit automation needs and potential challenges, specifically in rural and small urban areas. And we learn this directly from transit agencies, transit planners, and state DOTs in this study. And as for the methodology of the study that we have conducted a national survey with transit agencies focusing in rural, small urban, and urban areas. And if you see the definition here of what we have used as rural population less than 50,000, pretty common. Small urban population 50 to 200,000, and urban areas more than 200,000. And the lessons learned from the early implementation of automated vehicle technologies in rural, small urban areas, they could be useful for much more coverage and expanded use in the upcoming time. So we'll be also gathering the lessons learned. And for our study, we just have considered the bus transit operations when we are evaluating automated vehicle technologies. So as for our survey, the National Transit Agency survey, we have a database of transit agencies, mostly rural agencies as well as small urban agencies. So we have used our database to contact transit agencies to gather their input by way of a survey instrument. So we developed a survey instrument, and we had partners in our study at Qatar Center for Urban Transportation Research in University of South Florida. And we also have worked with experts in FDA, APTA, WOPI Center to review our survey materials to make sure if our survey materials gather relevant information that could be useful for useful for transit agencies, the results. So we conducted our surveys in November 2018, and we've contacted almost 1,700 agencies across the nation, and we got a total of 258 transit agency responses. And if you see the breakdown here, based on the category of the communities, we have most of our responses from rural transit agencies and a significant number of small urban transit agencies. And we also had some responses from urban transit agencies. And we thought the responses could be compared among these rural, small urban areas to see how the trends are with respect to the transit automation technologies among these three kinds of transit agencies. So like I mentioned, we only looked at automation technologies in the bus vehicles. So if you look at the breakdown of the various kind of bus transportation available within the rural and small urban and urban areas, you could see in rural areas, most of the bus transportation takes place in form of demand response for general public, although there are other kinds of transportation such as fixed route, flexible, a little bit BRT, ADA, complementary paratransit. And for small urban, most of the bus transportation is in form of traditional fixed route, same is the case for urban areas. But you could see that the breakdown is different among all these three different kinds of transit agencies. And you might have already seen these SAE levels of automation, SAE 5 levels of automation. 0 is no automation, 1 is driver assistance systems, 2 is partial automation. Most of the, I think Tesla's autopilot, GM Cruise, all of these fall into this level 2. And then we have conditional automation, 4 high automation, and then 5 full automation. I believe we don't have full automation, if I'm not wrong, but maybe I think Google's Waymo falls in level 4. But anyways, so what we have used when we have developed our survey questions, we have used the SAE levels of automation as a gauge to know if transit agencies are aware of these SAE levels of automation. That way we know what is their understanding about the automation technologies. So we asked, one of the question is, are you aware of SAE levels of vehicle automation? And I have summarized the responses from rural, small urban transit agencies. And interestingly enough, you see the responses is like, yes, I know them in detail. Yes, I know them generally. No, I don't know them. So you could see them interestingly here that very less percentage of agencies among rural, small urban agencies know them in detail. Although the trend seems to be increasing, in more people in urban agencies have much exposure, but still. But if you could, one of the interesting thing is like most of the agencies don't know about the SA levels of automation, and you could see the trend in rural and small urban areas, although the trend is looking much better in urban agencies. So the exposure of the SA levels is the knowledge of SA levels of automation is much lesser in rural and small urban areas. And we have also used FTA star plan as a gauge to understand the transit agency's understanding of automation in general for public transportation industry. So to give a quick preview of the SA star plan, this report defines a 5-year strategic transit automation research plan. It establishes research and demonstration framework to move the transit industry forward towards automation. So we have used, again, one more question is like, are you familiar with FTA's STAR plan? And again, a lot of agencies in rural and small urban areas were not knowledgeable about the FTA STAR plan. And the other question that we have used is like fully autonomous shuttles. Here are sample fully autonomous shuttles, Navia autonomous shuttle and Easy Mile autonomous shuttle, which one other question we have asked like is, do you know about the fully autonomous shuttles which fall under the category of level 4 or level 5 from the SAE categorization? And these were operated at the time when we sent out a survey in the Las Vegas, Nevada, and University of Michigan campus in Ann Arbor. So you can see, I mean, the results are much better here. Significant percentage of transit agencies in rural areas and small urban areas knew about these fully autonomous shuttles, much better than the SAE levels of automation or STAR plan. So one of the things that could be attributed because for this is these shuttles have received a lot of media attention and they had their presence in multiple conferences. So some of the transit agency personnel in rural and small urban areas might have had a chance to learn about them or ride in one at one of these conferences. But the exposure to these shuttles are much higher in rural areas and small urban areas, which is interesting. And then we started asking questions about how these technologies could be useful and applicable directly to them. So the questions that we asked is like, for which service do you think your agency could potentially use a fully autonomous shuttle, such as Navia or Easy Mile that we have just shown? We have also provided the pictures in our survey so they could see the pictures when we are asking about these fully autonomous shuttles, so they know what we are referring to. And when we ask like for which service do their agency use these shuttles, the options that we are given are traditional fixed route, BRT, flexible route, ADA, paratransit, demand response for general public, other. And then the last option is no, none. We do not plan to use fully autonomous shuttles in the near future. You could see this is a popular option among rural and small urban areas, although it is the majority in urban areas. But the interesting thing is there is demand for fully autonomous shuttles in rural area, among rural transit agencies as well as small urban transit agencies. And you could expect that there is going to be demand in urban transit agencies, but it's interesting to note that there is some demand in rural and small urban areas. If you look at the rural areas, agencies want to use fully autonomous shuttles for demand response service to provide to general public as well as to fixed route, although all kinds of bus transportation services have some kind of demand, which is motivating. If you look at the small urban areas, the same trend follows. There is demand for traditional fixed route and ADA paratransit and demand response services for general public. So there is definitely interest to use these shuttles in rural areas. And we have asked a follow-up question, which is like, which other ways do you think fully autonomous shuttles can be used to provide transportation services in your community? I know we have traditional forms of services, but with the AV shuttles, we could be more creative about how they could be applied to communities. And a couple of options that we provided are like circulatory bus service, feeder bus service for the first mile, last mile shuttles, filling service gaps, shuttles at airport, shuttles at university campus, shuttles on hospital, at retirement, shuttles at retirement communities. So primarily looper service and shuttle service, and then downtown or business park circulator. So as you could see, the downtown or business park circulator seems to be a favorite use case to apply autonomous shuttles among all kinds of communities. And if you look at rural communities specifically, all these kinds of option seems to have some sort of a use case for using autonomous autonomous shuttles. Same is a trend for small urban transit agencies. So definitely a lot of opportunities here. And after we have gathered input regarding fully autonomous shuttles, we also started asking questions regarding advanced driver assistance systems within the transit vehicles. Some of the ADAS features available in the latest transit vehicles are automation features in narrow lane or shoulder, so automation features to operate buses in narrow lane operations, precision docking specifically for BRT vehicles at the bus stations, platooning, which is a form of using radar and vehicle-vehicle communications to form and maintain close headway between at least two vehicles. And then other technologies, curb avoidance and automated emergency braking. So a couple of ADAS, automated driver assistance systems technologies available for transit vehicles. So when we started asking questions about ADAS, we kind of gave the survey respondents a preview of what are these. And so just like what is presented here, we gave a quick overview of what each technology does. And then we started asking questions about ADAS. So the question here is like, do you know about transit buses with advanced driver assistance systems, which fall in the category of SA level 1 or 2, which have automated functions such as narrow lane, shoulder operations, precision docking, platooning, and so forth, like we just mentioned. And the options that are presented is like no, and yes, we have transit buses with some ADAS features in our fleet currently. Or yes, I learned about the transit buses with ADAS in detail for potential use in our operations, and then just a plain S. You could see a good percentage of agencies in rural and small urban areas knew about the ADAS features, and some of them are thinking to implement in the future, which is motivating because they learned about the automated driver assistance systems, and they learned that for potential applications. And you could see that there is much less exposure needed in rural areas among these technologies, along with the fully autonomous shuttles. So there's definitely a need here for outreach. And as for the urban agencies, I mean, not focusing much, but if you could also compare how the rural areas and small urban areas compare to urban areas with respect to the transit agencies. So and one other question we ask is like applicability of automation technologies in transit. So the question goes like, in general, once the technology is ready to deploy, do you believe transit vehicles with automation would be beneficial for conducting some form of transit operations in your community? And if you could see, green is yes, red is no, and gray is not sure. You could definitely see there is a great interest. Transit agencies think that they believe transit vehicles with automation could be applicable to their communities to conduct some form of operations in rural and small urban areas. And it is logical to expect some pushback, and some respondents might not think it is possible. Maybe that is because of lack of exposure or knowledge about what is currently going on, what are their effectiveness and advantages. So, but yeah, once the technology is available, a significant amount of transit agencies in rural areas as well as small urban areas think that they could use it in their communities. And we asked for the timeline. Which automation features do you think your transit agency will be using in the next 5 years and 5 to 10 years? And I've split the responses between rural, small, urban agencies, and you see the various technology options available here. All the top of these options are ADAS, and the last one is fully autonomous shuttles. And you could see there is definitely interest to adopt these technologies in the next 5 years. This survey was conducted in 2018. So when you're thinking about next 5 years till 2023, and 5 to 10 years is from 2023 till the next 5 years. So you could see rural agencies are interested in technologies such as lane keep assist and collision avoidance in the next 5 years, and the same for the 5 to 10 years. But at the same time, there is some interest in all kinds of automation technologies for transit vehicles. The same is a trend for small urban areas. So that is definitely use cases for rural areas because there is interest. So any research that could help boost the confidence for rural transit or small urban transit agencies could help with implementation. Of course, funding is also a main element. But a question on procurement: how soon do you think your agency would pursue procurement of transit vehicles with some level of automation? And we see for rural areas, they starting from next 2 years, but the major adoption seems to be like in the next 5 to 10 years, they want to procure more, but you could see the demand as soon as possible in the next 10 years, which is 2019 and 2020. So definitely, I mean, like there is not a lot of exposure needed, and we asked like what type of technical assistance do the agencies need, specifically in rural agencies, that could help agencies towards automation. Agencies need one-stop website of information about the technologies and how they could be applicable, topical webinars, example RFPs. So all of these could help them better learn and implement automation technologies. And we asked what area of transit automation needs more research, and we could see there is definitely research needed in all areas, but some of the popular responses are rural use. I mean, like the two previous speakers emphasized how could automation technologies be applicable to rural use is one of the topmost mentioned need for research, along with safety and human factors, capital and operation costs. So, which is consistent among the rural areas based on presentations. So a quick summary of rural transit agencies. What are the advantages of having transit fixed route buses with some level of automation, be it anywhere from level 1 to 5? For potential operations, some of the advantages are enhanced safety, reduced human error, reliability, and less wait time, or better on-time performance. So if you look at the disadvantages, I'm sorry, if you look at the concerns of having fixed route with some level of automation, again, safety is an advantage and also a disadvantage if you think about it. Funding on cost is one of the concern. Trust of community, getting the trust of the community members. Knowledge and experience with the technology is also important, which could be lacking in rural areas. Reliability of technology, and how are these technologies, are they compliant with the ADA? Vehicle maintenance. One of the key point I want to make here is a significant number of rural agencies are not sure or not knowledgeable about potential concerns of automation to transit fixed route. And the same is the case for potential advantages. So they're not sure about what are the advantages by using automation technologies. So these are some of the ones that are mostly mentioned advantages or concerns. Similarly, advantages for using them for ADA, demand response, safety, reach more people, or expand more service, less operating cost. And if you look at the concerns, they again, same as for the previous service, safety, lack of driver or person on board to assist. Especially this is important for ADA paratransit vehicles because a person is very critical for ADA paratransit service, and if that is missing, it will be a problem. Funding, maintenance and service, rural area applicability in general, and concerns with wheelchair lifts and wheelchair restraint systems in rural areas. So to quickly summarize our findings, and I couldn't cover all the findings in our presentation, but a quick summary is like exposure of automated technologies for transit agencies and the potential use in the next few years seems to be increasing in communities, increasing as communities get more urban. And we found that more education, training, and outreach would be required, specifically for rural and small urban agencies, about transit automation technology. And this is based on successful pilots and implementations which are ongoing. So delivering the results of these pilots would help boost the confidence of rural and small urban agencies. And funding for the technologies could be challenging, and this is specifically challenging for rural and small urban areas. And transit agencies seems to be comfortable with level 1 and level 2 because it improves safety and reduce crashes. Agencies think that level 3 could make drivers rely much more on technology, which could sometimes be a problem. Level 4 and 5, agencies are not much confident about the applicability because it lacks the human element. And however, some agencies are willing to implement these level 4 and 5 technologies if available in the near future. With that, I think that should be the end of my presentation. The final report of the study is published if anyone is interested. So this is the cover page in case you want to look up the final report. But if not, I should be done. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Ranjit. It's interesting to see that snapshot in time. And can we look back and see the public transit interests in rural areas and how this changes as they become more familiar with AV? And so excellent to have that snapshot in time. So thank you, Ranjit.
Yep.
Our next and final presenter for this session is Omar Ahmad. He is University of Iowa's Deputy Director of the National Advanced Driving Simulator. With that, we turn it over to Omar.
Hi, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me. Thank you very much. Today I'm here to talk to you about the ADS for Rural America Demonstration Grant Project. And on this project, I'm serving as the project manager. Before I tell you a little bit more about the project, I want to point out that this project was funded under the ADS Demonstration Grant Program from the US DOT. And on this project, we have several important partners. So Iowa DOT is a very important part of what we're doing. We have a lot of cooperation from them. And then our two main technology partners are companies in the Midwest. One of them is called Autonomous Stuff. They're based in Morton or Peoria, Illinois. And another company is called Mandy Communications, and they're based in Madison, Wisconsin. And then, of course, I want to point out that I'm part of a wonderful group of people here at the University of Iowa. 2 or 3 years ago, when we wrote the proposal for this project, we were really interested in the demonstrations that were taking place around the country that involved automated vehicles. And it was very clear at that time that rural roadways were very much underrepresented in those demonstrations. And I think this is significant because while a smaller portion of Americans live in rural areas, nearly half of the traffic fatalities occur on rural roadways. So if automated vehicles are going to realize their promise and potential for improving safety, they need to do so on all types of roadways. Another very important reason why we are interested in the rural aspect of things is that in the US, we have an aging population. In fact, older adults are projected to outnumber children by the year 2035. And many of those adults live in rural America. And in rural America, we have little or no access to public transportation. So if you're an older American and you wish to maintain your freedom, your independence, it means being able to drive your vehicle. And then as you experience age-related cognitive decline, that freedom may be at risk. So automated vehicles present an incredible way to keep older folks and other mobility impaired folks, mobile, independent, free. So the vehicle that we're utilizing for our demonstration is based on a Ford Transit chassis, and because it's a US DOT grant, we had to meet the Buy American Act. And this is a mobility friendly vehicle. So once the chassis was purchased, it was upfitted to be ADA compliant. And our vehicle in its completed form will always be monitored or driven by a trained driver and a co-pilot. And it's built to support higher levels of automation, which I'll get into more detail here shortly. As I mentioned, the vehicle is ADA compliant, and so we've had a wheelchair lift installed. What I can tell you is that there are an incredible number different types, shapes, and sizes of wheelchairs out there. So for anyone that's trying to operate one of these vehicles, you have to go through a lot of training in order to gain an appreciation for what it takes to secure one of these properly in a vehicle. The ADS vehicle, this transit bus that we're utilizing, it has a number of different sensors. And these sensors are all needed to one extent or another to support the goals of our project. I'll get into that. I'll get into that in more detail here shortly. So our project is organized into 8 phases of data collection. And in fact, we're currently nearing the end of phase 0, which is the development phase. And this summer, we still expect to be able to start data collection in phase 1. And in each phase, we will do 10 complete drives through a rural area and make that data available. And then what we expect is that each phase will take about 3 months or a quarter of a year. And so the entire data collection will last 2 years. And as we go through each phase, we expect the vehicle to become more and more sophisticated in terms of its automation capabilities. And so the rural route that we've chosen, this is a 47-mile loop that we drive clockwise. And all of these roads have been intentionally chosen to be very, very representative of roadways that one would experience in a rural setting. So we have a good combination of 2-lane highways with and without shoulders, city streets. We even have an interstate portion. We have roadways that have really nice, really nicely marked lane markings, but also roadways with lane markings that are worn out, and roadways with no lane markings. And then while most of the route is a paved route, we definitely have a portion that is unpaved, and in fact, it's a gravel road. And once again, if we're going to have automated vehicles, being driven in rural settings, gravel is certainly one situation that they need to be able to handle. So there are four stops on our route, and these 4 stops represent places that people may want to go to. So there's a marketplace, there's a community center, there's a casino, and then there's a public library. This entire route is mapped in high definition by Manley Communications, which basically means that we have an extremely accurate map, accurate to within a few centimeters, that allows the vehicle to precisely locate itself within a specific lane, despite the weather conditions. And so one thing that I just want to point out is we chose this route not with the idea that, oh, we want to show how an automated vehicle can be entirely successful. If I wanted to pick a route where I would be sure that we have a successful demonstration in terms of the automation being able to handle all the situations, that route would look very different than this one. But our goal for this was to really pick roadways that were very much representative and intersections that were very much representative without worrying about whether the automation would be able to handle it or not, because I think it's really important that we gain a good understanding of where automation is going to work and where it's not going to work, and then to try and unpack the reasons why. And that is central to what we're trying to do here in Iowa. As I mentioned, the vehicle will always be driven by somebody who's trained, and they'll have a co-pilot as well. But we will have passengers in our vehicles, and these passengers will be the riders from the local communities that we're planning to drive through. And we're recruiting mobility impaired folks. So that means they're either older or they have some type of a mobility impairment. Maybe they need the aid of a walker or a cane, or they have a wheelchair, or they have some type of a visual impairment. And we're interested in having these folks as passengers because we want to really collect data on their perception and trust in automation. So the previous presenters today have done a great job of talking about what makes rural areas different and what are the challenges. And I guess I just want to highlight some of the areas that I think are make rural area a challenge, and what makes it potentially different from a lot of the urban testing that we're seeing. So, you know, while rural areas have roadways with speed limits that are overall lower than an interstate, but the speed differentials between vehicles are far greater. So the same roadway, you're going to have vehicles traveling at 55, 60, but they're sharing that same exact roadway with vehicles that are much slower, such as farm equipment, or in fact, vehicles that are stopped. It's very common in Iowa, and I imagine in other states as well, to have a school bus that's completely stopped to pick up kids that is on that same roadway where vehicles are traveling 55 miles an hour. And so in a rural setting, generally you have many, many points of entry and exit on the same roadway, which is very different from an interstate where you have controlled access. It's very clear where you get on an interstate and it's very clear you get off. And everyone on an interstate is traveling in the same direction, not so in a rural setting. And generally the road surfaces vary significantly. On the same roadway, you may have a portion that's really well paved, really well marked, and then suddenly with little or no warning, it could have really poor lane markings, or suddenly it could become a gravel roadway. And as I mentioned, road curvature is an issue, and it severely limits the line of sight. So you could come around a curve, and then all of a sudden you'll see a farm equipment or a school bus that's very slow or stopped. And so these are just some of the challenges that I think make rural areas unique. This project is about once again understanding where things are going to work well in rural areas and where they're not going to work well. And the way that we're going to do that is we're going to collect data. We're going to collect a lot of data from the various sensors that are on the vehicle, and this will contain information about the automation performance of the vehicle, and then data about what feeds into that performance. And in addition to this, we'll have video data of the driver and the passengers, and questionnaire data from the riders regarding their trust and acceptance of this technology. In addition to questionnaire data, we'll actually also have physiological data. So they'll be wearing a device on their wrist that gives us physiological data, because we're very interested in looking at their anxiety and stress. So, you know, we believe that what's going to happen is that trust and acceptance will be gained as people experience the AV over time. But how is that? What feeds into that trust and acceptance? And this data that we're collecting will allow us to essentially correlate their physiological state with what the vehicle is doing and what part of the route it's on. And so this will be, I think, a really interesting deep dive into looking at those issues, being able to have all of that data available. As I mentioned, we'll have a lot of video data. There'll be a forward camera view, there'll be a rear camera view, and all of this video of the forward and the rear, as well as of the people that are in the vehicle, it'll be synced and timestamped. And so you'll be able to correlate it with all the other data that we're collecting. And there'll be a lot of data. And so there will be about 210 terabytes of data. And so that means that this is not something that you can put on a thumb drive or an external hard disk and pass around. And so what we have come up with is an approach to effectively share this data through a cloud-based infrastructure that we'll manage here at the University of Iowa. We'll have a way for users everywhere to access this data, and there'll be a data access portal. And that'll allow tiered access to this data, and data will become available as it's collected. So we expect that within a week or two of collecting the phase 1 data, it'll be available on this cloud-based infrastructure. For those of you that are interested, I'll have a link to a website at the end of my presentation that you're welcome to go to and it'll have information about how you can get to the data, and then it'll also have information about how, if you're interested, you can sign up for a quarterly newsletter to stay up to date about our progress. And so, you know, my goal today was to really talk about this demonstration grant that is taking place here at the University of Iowa and on rural roadways in Iowa. But I hope you don't mind. I'm going to take just a couple minutes to offer you some of our lessons learned and some issues for consideration. And many of the things that I'll talk about here are definitely my opinions and may not reflect the opinions of my employer or the people who funded this grant. So what I'll say, first of all, is that you know, we've been working on this vehicle for quite some time now, and while we're not done, we're getting closer. But AVs, automated vehicles, are very complicated. They're very expensive, and they're fickle. And what I mean by that is that one day something will work, seemingly work, and then the next day it won't, and it won't be obvious why it's not working. And so more equipment means more failures, and these are not vehicles that you can take to your local gas station to have the repairs done. You need to have either the support of the manufacturer, or you need to have specially trained people on your own staff in order to be able to handle these issues. As if we want automated vehicles to operate effectively in all kinds of rural areas, we're going to need better connectivity in rural areas to support the data needs. And automated vehicles needs a lot of data about its environment. And that becomes more and more important as we experience weather change and as we try to operate the vehicle in bad weather or in snowy weather. We need more data yet then. And so we potentially need a digital infrastructure to support operation across all seasons and the diversity of the geographic regions. So that's something to keep in mind. It's important to think about safety. You know, automated vehicles are supposed to be safer, and they certainly have a lot of potential to be safer. But they are, right now, in their current form, they're programmed to be very safe. When in doubt, they're safe in the sense that they travel much slower than other vehicles on that same roadway might. And so an automated vehicle may be traveling at 18 miles an hour on a roadway where you have a posted speed limit of 25. And an automated vehicle may be traveling at 50 on a roadway where the speed limit is posted at 65. And in multiple lane roadways, that may not be an issue because other people can go around it. But in rural areas where you have one lane traveling in each direction, that could be a huge issue. So something to keep in mind. In my opinion, marketing hype and buzzwords are clouding our understanding of automated vehicles. And there's a lot of fancy words that are being thrown around that I don't do most of us any service. And so we need to really think about how do we fully understand what an automated vehicle, what it's capable of doing. And so Ranjit was talking about the SAE levels of automation, but his own research, it makes it clear that, first of all, a very small percentage of people feel very comfortable with what the SAE levels of automation are. And even then, if somebody tells you that they have a level 4 automated vehicle, it doesn't mean that it's level 4 everywhere. It means it's level 4 within a certain operational design domain, which means effectively what areas, what roadways, what situations it can operate as a level 4 vehicle. So I think we have a lot of work to do together as a community to get a handle on this. And you know, we are the informed folks. And so when I talk about the greater public, I think we have an even higher bar to cross. And I also just want to throw in my complete support for funding for solutions that are really targeted to solving the critical use cases. And I think Amy and David, perhaps, they've both pointed out the importance of healthcare and transporting people in rural areas to regional centers where the critical services are. And I think that's very important. You know, we have a regional hospital here in the university at the University of Iowa, but we did not include that hospital as a stop. And there was a very good reason for it, because it would have made our route even longer and even more complicated than it already was. But if I was to get another crack at it, potentially with more funding, that would be something we'd love to do here in Iowa. And so with that, I'll stop talking, and thank you for your time. And here's the link to that website where you can get more information about our project. Thank you.
Omar, thank you so much for your presentation and telling us about the demonstration project you're working on, as well as put lessons learned and considerations. So this presentation portion of our program, thank you to all the speakers for all of your great presentation and insights. We are going to move in now to the Q&A session of today's event. So we'd like you to please feel free to input any questions that you have for our speakers into the Q&A section of the chat, and our chat moderator will go ahead and voice your question. So we will move into the Q&A right now, and Jeffrey, I know you have been serving as the moderator for the Q&A chat. If you would go ahead, please.
Sure. Our first question actually has two parts, and they are related. So let's just start with the first part of that question. And that is, how are current AVs dealing with work zones and flaggers? And it's mostly looking at this kind of dynamic situation and how, with regards to rural areas. So if any of our panelists would care to take a stab at that one.
I'm happy to say something real quick. Here in Iowa, we did a couple of years ago, we did a demonstration project involving work zones. And I'll just give you the quick summary. And that is work zones, you know, they're a dynamic thing. They change from day to day. A work zone that is active one day, maybe active only during certain hours in the day, and then not active at night. And so if you're going to have a work zone and you want automated vehicles to recognize it and react to it, you have to have a data exchange of some type that is very accurately updated and maintained in order to support that. So that's the short summary of our demonstration project from a couple of years ago.
Thank you. Anybody else?
I was just going to add real quickly that I think, you know, we talk about connected vehicles and autonomous vehicles. And as Omar said, an autonomous vehicle is going to have to be connected, because there are those dynamic situations, whether it's a work zone or whatever, to say it's got to recognize what's going on and how that changes the needs of the vehicle to navigate through that work zone. So I think, you know, again, the people managing work zones are going to go, okay, now I'm going to have that technology at the beginning and end of work zones to communicate with those autonomous vehicles. And as Omar said, that, you know, that means more technology in rural areas. You know, in rural America, it's easy to get into an area and look at, you know, there's no cell phone coverage, none of that. So there's going to have to be a lot of that in conjunction with autonomous vehicles in rural areas.
Thanks, David.
And a trusted source that's managing that data exchange, because I think that's really, really important. Because, and is that data exchange going to be managed by a public entity, or will it be a private entity that's managing it? And there are pros and cons to both of that.
And I think the next part of that question is on this theme of changing conditions. And so the answers may be very similar, but what about specifically for rural roads where you've got heavy snowfall? And it's a combination of not only not being able to see the lane markings, but it's also the sensors that are being intermittently or temporarily blocked by that snow. And so the question is, you know, how do we expect to see AVs manage in those types of changing situations, especially in rural areas. And it could go right back to the managing the data with a trusted source, Omar. But I'm curious what other people think as well.
Well, I just start by saying I think what Omar is doing, I think those types of projects are going to be so important to really say what are those challenges, and they are different in rural areas, frontier areas compared to urban areas, and I think that's why it's going to be so important to do that, to say how does it look, what do we learn, okay, we got to improve this and that, and already it's proven to be challenging just in easy cases where you don't throw too many challenges at it. And it's just, again, amazing how as human drivers, we can kind of tune out when we're driving, but we are hopefully still looking at so many things. And yet when you go to program a vehicle to do that, again, it is very complex. So I think we've got a lot still to learn and to perfect before we see these in a lot of areas.
And I think to build on that, I think that's what we all are collectively saying, is that there needs to be more of these studies in the rural areas, and we don't fall victim to, if it works in an urban area, it'll work in the rural areas. And I think that's the fear that many of us in rural communities have, is that we're not seeing those detailed studies of the high risk rural roads, the lack of pavement markings, the weather conditions on those types of roads, that somehow what's being done in these pilot urban studies, we can just pick it up and make it work in rural. And so, from my perspective, we just need to start having some of these pilots truly done in rural communities to understand the conflicts that are different, and aren't going to allow autonomous vehicles to run the same way as they may be in an urban setting.
You can have a demonstration that runs extremely smoothly one day because the stars have aligned and the weather is good, and in fact it could run really well 98% of the time, but then you have an inclement weather event and then everything seems to fall apart. And I'm not sure if it's a fair comparison, but we saw this in Texas with the power grid, right? And I think it really speaks to redundancy or lack of it. And we need automated vehicles that have redundant, that have access to redundant sources of data. So if something fails with the sensor that's on the vehicle, and I think the sensor-based approach on the vehicle is a great approach, right? But the moment the sensor gets dirt splashed on it or snow, whatever on it, now you need that data another way, and how is it going to get to you? And so potentially a high definition map or some connection to another source of data, whether it's something on the roadway. I think we need to explore all of those options.
Very good. The next question is with regards to public-private partnerships. And while this may not necessarily be specific to rural areas, it's a great question. And it's with regards to how the data sharing between our various levels of government that are housing the data, and then their public-private partnerships with private entities. And so the question is, do you see agencies supporting charging businesses for the use of public data that would help support the infrastructure for future transportation needs? It is a tough question, but I'm just curious what your thoughts are, and maybe we take it up a level and just say, all right, how is this going to work when we are sharing more and more? We're sharing more data, we're sharing more resources in order to make our systems work.
Yeah, that's going to be interesting. I mean, you've got in general that, the public, whether it's the roadway infrastructure or whatever, is out there for people to use. So private enterprise uses it. I mean, you're seeing more now with the Ubers and Lyfts about curbside management, and cities trying to say, hey, if these for-profit companies are using it, do we have to make some changes? And I think that will be interesting. Obviously, if I think the public can benefit from it, and we've made some case examples where if the technology works, it is a benefit to the public, that I'm thinking that the government would probably say, well, if there's a public benefit, we're not going to start charging people to use that infrastructure. But there'll probably have to be some investment by private industry as well. We know that, as part of the infrastructure bill, there's a lot going into broadband and stuff in rural areas that needs that. So hopefully that will help with some infrastructure. But I think we're going to need private entities to come in as well alongside and invest as well. And, they'll have to figure out that business model to see what that return is. And as I said earlier, too, that's going to be interesting based on, the ownership models of these things. It's, talk, if we all have our own autonomous vehicle, you'll get, some incremental savings and things like going through intersections and things like that. But I think when you get into the shared ownership model and some things where you maybe see more benefits, but I think it's going to take a partnership. The private industry can't wait for government to pay it all. And I think government certainly needs private companies to come in and help fund some of this too.
We're also going to have to find a way that we don't fall victim to the broadband, where the private sector didn't feel there was enough profit to invest in the rural communities. And you don't want to see us slide down that slippery slope when it comes to investing in autonomous vehicles in rural areas as well. So what's the carrot and the stick incentive for the public and private sector to make things change?
So for transit agencies, using autonomous technologies, public-private partnership is a key, because when public transit agencies purchase vehicles from the providers, right now, I think the private entities are trying different models, but there should be a consistent and a promising framework that could work for public transit agencies while working with various of these automotive and technology companies as well.
Good. And then our next question actually could be answered, and I'd like to hear everybody's answer to this question. And part of it was answered essentially in your presentations, but it'd be nice to get kind of a summary from each of you as to what are the biggest challenges that you see regarding automated vehicles in rural and frontier areas. And David, we'll start with you.
Well, I think Omar covered a lot in what they're facing in their, that demonstrating that route. I mean, it is the infrastructure from a communication standpoint, what the roadways look like. I think a lot of things Amy talked about too, from the changes in weather. You've got the farm equipment, the sight lines, those challenges I think are all there. And the more we can have those tests and pilot demonstrations like Omar is doing to say, how do we keep picking away at those different challenges and finding solutions to get us to that long-term solution. And so I know technology moves fast, but I'm guessing we're still a good decade away from having some of those opportunities. So they're not insurmountable, but there's a lot of those little ones that we got to take care of.
So from a transit perspective, getting funds for funding rural transit is currently a challenge. And if you think about spending, say, 500 grand for like a shuttle, it's super expensive for rural transit agencies. So getting the technology, spending so much money for their operations in rural areas is definitely one of the greatest challenge. And if we figure out to arrange funding rural transit agencies with technologies, the next one would be convincing the users that they're going to be safer, which will have a learning curve. I mean, it'll take a while, but those are the two bigger challenges of AVs in transit sector for rural areas specifically. Yeah.
And I think on top of that, one of the biggest hurdles in rural populations, which tends to have aging population, is I'm convinced that people are visual learners. Until they actually can see the technology and participate in the technology, they're always going to be afraid to embrace the technology, which is why I think there's a great opportunity to pilot, like I mentioned in my presentation, within hospitals at a campus where parking is at a premium, and if they can run an autonomous shuttle within a controlled environment to get people from the far ends of the parking to their appointment versus walking that distance, it might be allowing them to have that built into their own ecosystem. But until then, this is something George Jetson, and they're never going to see it, and it's going to be us trying to overcome that fear and uncertainty of the unknown.
It seems like it's absolutely going to take incremental steps. And I mean, that's such a good example of a good pilot to get people familiar with it and less fearful.
And if there are more pilots in rural areas, other rural communities could relate to themselves on how it could be. And that is where I think Omar's study would come into place, because it is more applicable to rural communities. And once we see successful results, I think more rural communities could be confident. So the more number of pilots and successful demonstrations, I think the better confidence rate.
Yeah, I think I just want to, I feel like what's going to come out of our demonstration is success stories, but we're going to have probably just as many, if not more, failures or challenges to talk about. But I think that's very important, because what we don't want is misperceptions about where we are in terms of what the technology can do. I think there are certain places in which the technology is potentially ripe for implementation, but in the vast majority of the roadways that we have in both urban and rural locations, it'll be a long time before we can say that we have a fully autonomous vehicle. And there's a lot of reasons for it. And so when I hear that, rural transportation agencies are potentially investing $500,000 in a single shuttle, I mean, I think that's great. But I think we have to keep in mind that shuttle in 3 or 4 years may be obsolete, because the sensors that are on it are considered old and no longer serviceable. And so in the initial phases, we're going to have a lot more continual investment in order to see that. So I'm not trying to be pessimistic, but I just think it's very important that we all have a better understanding of where we're at, where we are.
That also goes along with when you think of public transportation, because that's a really large investment to make in a vehicle. And just working with so many of the transit providers, their biggest concern is providing rides and being able to have the investment to be able to provide the autonomous vehicle for them to demonstrate will be a huge factor.
Well, and Omar, that makes me think about, again, that we don't create these proprietary systems, that you have that more plug and play kind of open architecture, so that, if those sensors or something get outdated, I don't have to scrap the whole vehicle, but I can incorporate those newer technologies. And I think that's going to be important too, is that we, as we talk about those standards and those communications protocols and stuff, that it is kind of open architecture and more universal, that you don't have to say, geez, now all of a sudden I'm driving in a work zone in a different county or city, and now what communications there is between that autonomous vehicle and that work zone is different. So a lot of work to do.
Yeah, in my opinion, we need public involvement in key interface phases. That has to be, in my opinion, publicly managed if we're going to keep the environment like competitive, and a competitive environment that's fair for all the participants is going to be better for the public.
All right, I think we've got time for one last question. And normally I'd like to end on a very positive note. This particular question says, which is, I think, a good one. It says, what's the most frustrating part about researching AVs in a rural setting?
That we're not doing it enough?
Yeah, I think it's, the funding tends to go where there's big numbers of people. And so that, again, can focus on the big urban areas. And we need to show that, yeah, we need to do it. And so hopefully Omar's is just the start of some of that. And again, maybe with the federal lands focus, to say a lot of federal lands are in rural areas and we can get those folks involved in some of this as well might help.
All right, Jill, I think it's back to you to wrap it up.
All right. Well, excellent. I think this has just been a fabulous session. I want to thank all the panelists for their very thoughtful answers, and also to all of you for your great questions. Very fruitful discussion. I want to point out, after we end this webinar, you should be receiving Professional Development Hour certification, and be sure to check your email. That will be coming from Chad Martin. And so next, we want to also make sure to make you aware of this year, the Pennsylvania AV Summit will be held virtually, and it's using the remote platform. It's going to take place from October 26th through the 28th, beginning at 1 p.m., going till 4:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time each day. There's going to be a plenary session held at the beginning of each day, and there will be a feature of presentations and discussions from prominent keynote speakers. And it's going to be followed by multiple breakout sessions on different cutting edge topics. So this year, the summit is going to focus on the challenges and the opportunities of moving people and goods, and the specific topics of automation, workforce, and also freight. So be sure to check the Pennsylvania AV Summit website for any updates, and we absolutely hope to see you in October. Again, thank you very much to the presenters, the panelists, and all of you for taking part in this discussion. So have a great day.